So, have you ever walked into a coffee shop and that smell of coffee hits you and you're like, oh man, that smells so good. I could really go for a cup of coffee right now. Or maybe you're already there working at a table and the group next to you is just whispering amongst themselves and they're giggling and they're laughing and you start to wonder, what are they laughing at? Are they laughing at me? What's wrong with me? Why do I feel so paranoid right now? So, what's up with that? Why do we react a certain way in some situations, and why is it that sometimes we might react inappropriately in seemingly normal situations? It turns out our brain has a lot to do with our emotional responses. Hi everyone, I'm Jeff Olney. I'm a researcher here at the University of Michigan, and in this video we'll explore exactly what's going on in our brain when we're feeling these certain emotions, and hopefully we can use these understandings of these brain systems to better improve our mental health. So, if we see something in our environment, one way we can react is just to do nothing. We're totally neutral. That thing doesn't faze us at all. But if we see something good, we might actually be drawn to that thing. We might want it. We could say that we desire it. Or if we see something bad, it might completely freak us out. It might make us feel really uneasy or upset, or it might make us feel paranoid. We could say that we're dreading that thing. These emotional responses are very important to us. If we see something very beneficial like food or social contact, we'll immediately desire these things. On the other hand, if we see something potentially harmful like spoiled food or a predator, we're immediately going to dread these things because they're potentially dangerous to us. But we live in a world that's very busy and has a lot of things going on, so what is it that determines our emotional responses to these things? Well, for one, it depends on what that thing is. So, for example, if we come across a normal everyday house cat, that's not very noteworthy. We're probably not going to react to it very much. But if instead of a house cat we see, for example, a lion, that's a totally different situation. That is cause for alarm. We're probably going to dread that. On the other hand, it also depends on what the context is. So if we see a bear in a zoo, again, that's probably something that we're not really going to react to because it's likely in an enclosure, we're a safe distance away from it, so we're not going to react to it. On the other hand, if you're walking home and see a bear in the street, again, that's a totally different situation. I would freak out about it, and I'm sure everybody else here would too. But what people don't realize is that your emotional reactions actually depend quite a great deal on how your brain is wired. In fact, there's a part of your brain called the nucleus accumbens that's responsible for these feelings of desire and dread. In fact, if we zoom in on this part of the brain, we can actually see that it's very nice and neatly organized, such that the front half triggers feelings of desire, whereas the back half triggers feelings of dread. So you may have noticed that section in yellow that lied between desire and dread, that triggers a mixed emotion. And you might be thinking to yourself, what the heck is a mixed emotion supposed to be in this case? Is that some sort of like weird combination of desire and dread where you desire something that you also dread? And actually, yeah, that's exactly what it's supposed to be. So this happens in people, and you might actually know somebody like it, or you might be somebody like that yourself. So if you know anyone who likes skydiving, bungee jumping, riding roller coasters, these people seek out activities that give them the thrill. To put it another way, they actually desire situations that fill them with dread. And so it is actually possible for somebody to experience both emotions simultaneously. Okay, back to desire and dread in the brain. This organization that we see actually isn't set in stone. In fact, this is really what we see in a very typical environment. But we can actually reorganize the brain if we put the person in a calm environment. We can actually see that much less of the brain is now responsible for triggering dread. And we see the opposite if we put that person in a stressful environment. A much greater proportion of the brain is now responsible for triggering feelings of dread. So this might be kind of hard for you guys to believe, but I trust that most of you have actually experienced something like this in your own life. So let's say that you're at home with your family, you guys are watching a fun little movie, and you hear a noise outside. Because you're in this kind of calm environment and you're in a safe place, you're probably not going to think much of that noise. You're just going to think, oh, it's the wind or it's the neighborhood cat. You're not really going to react to it. But let's change things up a little bit, and instead of being at home watching a movie with your friends and family, now you're home alone watching a scary movie in the dark by yourself, and you hear that noise again, you're going to have a very different reaction. You're going to think to yourself, oh my gosh, there's an intruder outside, somebody's trying to break in, or worse, the monster from the movie has come to life and is trying to get me. Together, this shows that your surroundings actually have a pretty big influence on how you respond emotionally in different situations. So if you are in a calm environment, you're much more likely to respond positively. But if you're in a stressful environment, you're much more likely to respond with dread. And this is actually even more true over the long term. So if you have a very stable upbringing, then you're much more likely to grow up to be a much more level-headed, even-keeled person. But if you have a very stressful upbringing, so there's a lot of financial strain in your family, or there's a lot of personal or social stress, you're much more likely to grow up and be an anxious person. But this isn't even the whole picture. There's more than just our surroundings that helps influence our emotional reactions. In fact, there's a pretty large neurochemical component that helps shape how we respond emotionally in different situations. But first, let's go over how neurotransmitters work in the brain. Basically, neurotransmitters are these small molecules that you can kind of think of as keys, and they interact with receptors on your brain cells that you can think of as locks. When these neurotransmitters interact with these receptors, they typically trigger a reaction. Now, the neurotransmitter dopamine is actually the neurochemical currency that your brain uses for emotional reactions. This neurotransmitter acts on two different receptors. There's the dopamine 1 receptor, or the D1 receptor, and the dopamine 2 receptor, or the D2 receptor. And the D1 receptor conveys both desire and dread, whereas the D2 receptor conveys only dread. So why is this important? Well, it's important for a few reasons, actually. First, specific drugs, either illicit or prescription, may act on the D1 receptor to increase desire. In fact, this is actually believed to be a major component of addiction. When you start taking drugs over and over again, your desire is ramped up to the point where the most important thing to you is just taking more drugs. On the other hand, you can trigger dread through the D1 or D2 receptor. Sometimes a feeling of dread triggered in this way is known as paranoid psychosis, which is a symptom associated with schizophrenia. So, what the heck is paranoid psychosis? This is actually something that we see sometimes in patients with schizophrenia, where they'll come across something neutral in their environment, and rather than having no reaction to it, due to abnormal circuitry in their brain, they'll actually have these really intense feelings of dread towards it. And what happens is that they'll construct these really wild reasons as to why they're experiencing this dread. So let's look at an example of what paranoid psychosis looks like. Have you ever been driving down the road and seen these dark marks along the lanes? These are actually called crack seals, because they seal cracks in the road. Anyway, you've probably seen them and thought nothing of them, because they really have no impact on your life. But somebody experiencing paranoid psychosis may have a completely different reaction. In fact, there's actually a case report where somebody with schizophrenia began to experience intense feelings of dread towards these crack seals. And he reasoned that these marks in the road were evidence that he was actually being watched, and that these crack seals were there because people were following him and wearing down the road. Now, as you can imagine, living with paranoid psychosis makes things really difficult, but we can actually use our understanding of these brain systems that are responsible for both desire and dread to help alleviate these symptoms. So, our goal in this situation is to minimize dread, but if you remember back to when we talked about the different dopamine receptors, we know that the D1 receptor is responsible for both desire and dread. So if we try to block the D1 receptor, yes, we'll affect dread, but we'll also affect desire as well. And since desire is such an important emotional response, we need to leave that intact. So the D1 receptor may not be the best route here. On the other hand, the D2 receptor only triggers dread. So if we use a drug that blocks the D2 receptor, we can effectively reduce the amount of dread that the person is experiencing. In fact, such drugs are currently on the market that block the D2 receptor, and they're actually used to treat symptoms of schizophrenia. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, this is all well and good and everything, but why do we even have to give this person drugs? We already went over how our surroundings can affect emotional responses, so why can't we just take somebody with schizophrenia and put them in a calm environment to alleviate their symptoms? Let's call this the chill pill solution. So the reasoning here is that somebody with schizophrenia has a brain wired in such a way that they're likely to feel dread in most situations. But with a chill pill solution, if we take that person and put them in a calm environment, we might be able to reduce their frequency of experiences where they feel dread. And I think this makes a lot of sense on paper. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that this works. But there is actually evidence for the reverse. So if you have somebody at risk of schizophrenia, they may start experiencing symptoms like paranoid psychosis, which causes them to stress out. Then as time goes on, other people may notice her symptoms, so they start treating them differently, like they're crazy or something's wrong with them. This might actually make them feel even more self-conscious about their situation and start a negative feedback loop where they experience more and more stress as time goes on. This would actually make matters worse because this causes their brain to reorganize in such a way that they're now wired to experience dread more often. So we may not be able to treat paranoid psychosis with a calm environment, but a stressful life has been shown to make schizophrenia even worse. So with that, I just want to end on a quote from Vincent van Gogh. On a letter he sent to his brother, he wrote, "Let us not forget the little emotions are the great captains of our lives, and that we obey them without knowing it." And I just want to point out this piece here where he said, emotions are the great captains of our lives. Hopefully after watching this video, you'll recognize that emotions might be the captains of our lives, but research has shown that our brain controls our emotions, and we can actually use our understanding of these brain systems to help improve our mental health. So thank you everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed exploring your emotions through science and research. Bye now.